All right, it looks like we are streaming live now. So this is Chair Andrew French of the Kansas Corporation Commission, and I'm convening this special work study session of our agency. I'm joined by Commissioner Susan Duffy and Commissioner Dwight Keene. And the purpose of this work study session is to hear directly from the Southwest Power Pool on the February 2021 winter weather event and grid emergency, and get some response from them as to what the actions were from the perspective of the Southwest Power Pool and how they've responded since the event. So we are joined by Lanny Nickel, Chief Operating Officer of Southwest Power Pool, and Sam Loudenslager, the regulatory whiz and liaison to all the states. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Lanny and Sam, and you can begin your presentation however you like.
Well, thank you, Chairman, and thank you to the commissioners of the Kansas Corporation Commission for allowing Sam and I to be here today. Sam, do you want to start with any words of introduction before I jump into the details?
No, I don't think so, Lanny. I think you might as well go ahead and hit it hard. Thank you, though.
All right. Well, thanks, Sam. I do have a slide deck, a presentation, and I don't know if I'm the one that will be presenting that or if someone else will be running that in the background.
I believe you can share it. If you can't, then I can.
I can certainly do that. I just let me see if I can bring that up real quick. The operative word being quick. Okay.
We see it.
All right. Well, good. So let's jump into it, as Sam said. I'm going to start again. Thank you very much for allowing me to be here today. I know it's been a couple of months, actually closing in on 3 months now. It's hard to believe since we've had this experience, and it was truly a once, at least for me, once in a lifetime experience. I hope to not ever see something like this happen again, but I tell you, once you've experienced it, you learn a lot. And one of the things that you learn is we need to do everything we can to prevent this from happening again. And I'll share more about an effort that is already underway to learn from the event, to document and report the things that either went well or didn't go so well, and also some improvements that will be recommended as part of that activity. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But so I apologize if you've already heard anything at all about the event, or if you've read anything about it, and feel like you've exhausted your knowledge on what you possibly could know about it. I will share everything I know. And then, of course, we can entertain questions and dialogue and hopefully have a really good conversation about what went well and what didn't go so well. Let me begin by just describing a little bit about who SPP is. We are what is referred to by the federal government, by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, as a regional transmission organization, and there are 9 of us who operate across the North American continent. There are areas of the North American continent that do not have an RTO or an independent system operator, ISO, as that is referred to, that operates within those areas. And so, but we operate in really the central part of the United States. We border the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, otherwise known as ERCOT, to the south, and then we border the Canadian border to the north, the Western Interconnection to our west, and then primarily the Mid-Continent ISO, also known as MISO, to our east. We cover about 14 different states, of which Kansas is one, and is really kind of in the middle part of our footprint. We have a lot of responsibilities, but primarily our responsibilities consist of maintaining reliability on the transmission network or the transmission system that we have responsibility for. We also operate a wholesale energy market and make sure that wholesale energy is procured and delivered to the utilities that interconnect on our footprint so that they can use to pass on to their end use consumers. And then we plan the future transmission system as needed to maintain reliability and as needed to ensure that wholesale energy can be delivered as cheaply or inexpensively as possible. So talk a little bit more about the transmission system that we're responsible for. This slide shows that SPP receives energy from generators that are interconnected with the transmission system it operates, and then we deliver that energy reliably across that transmission system to points of delivery where utilities pick up the energy and pass that on through their distribution systems to end-use consumers. So basically that whole pink area to the left is what we're responsible for operating reliably. We have two key reliability objectives. If I could boil down how we maintain reliability, it's by really meeting these two objectives. One is to make sure that we balance supply of energy with the demand to consume that energy at all times. And that happens on a second by second basis. And whenever we experience imbalances where we either have more supply than we need, or we have more demand than we have supply, then we have to do something. We have to take action pretty quickly in order to restore that balance so that we don't lose control, so to speak, of the system. Once we lose control of the system, automated tools, automated systems began to take over in order to correct. And when that happens, sometimes you can experience cascading outages, and that's not a situation any of us want to be in. So if we can do things in a controlled fashion, we can make sure that the recourse that is taken is managed well, and that the aftermath is limited to a smaller portion and area of the system. The second reliability objective is to make sure that the facilities of the transmission network, the transmission lines, transformers, and all of the protective devices that are on the system are operated within their safe operating limits. They're designed to be able to transmit a certain amount of energy, and we have to make sure that we respect those limits. And generally, the way we correct for excessive energy being delivered across a facility is to simply redispatch a generation. Over 99% of the time, that is the appropriate recourse we take. We move generation up in one area and down in another, and that will restore the energy consumption across that facility to a reliable level. There are times when we don't have enough generation to redispatch, where we might have to do what we call local load shedding in order to reduce the energy consumption across a particular facility to within its reliable operating limits. And again, we do that to maintain control of the grid, because once a facility is used beyond its safe operating limit, there's automated devices that will cause that facility to trip out of service. And if that happens, which then causes another facility to be overloaded, that facility could trip out. And then you have what's referred to as a cascading outage situation. And so both of these objectives are maintained in real time and intended to prevent those cascading events from occurring.
Are local load shed events, is that something that is common or still relatively uncommon? How often would you say that SPP has to take that action?
It's relatively uncommon. And again, that's primarily because we have over 800 generators connected to our grid. And usually it's effective to just simply redispatch those generators in order to reduce the energy consumption on a particular facility.
Thank you.
All right. So one of the analogies that we've used a lot to kind of describe at a high level what SPP does, we're basically like air traffic controller of the electric, at least the transmission electric network. Much like air traffic controller doesn't own airplanes or airlines or airports, and much like air traffic controller is really responsible for making sure that a plane gets from one location to another safely, that's much like our responsibility for the system. I mean, we don't own the utilities, we don't own the generators, the transmission lines. None of that do we own, but we are responsible for making sure electricity is delivered reliably from the generator that's producing the energy to the distribution utility that's consuming it or passing that energy on to its consumers. We operate in the Eastern Interconnection. I will note that the power grid of North America is split up into 3 interconnections, which just simply means that the interconnections operate asynchronously from each other. And we're connected, the 3 interconnections are connected by DC ties. Now, again, I mentioned that SPP's footprint really resides in the western part of the Eastern Interconnection. We do connect with the Western Interconnection by virtue of DC ties that allow us to transfer up to a little over 1,200 megawatts of energy from west to east or east to west. And we're connected to ERCOT by virtue of 2 DC ties that enable transfers up to about 800 megawatts between SPP and ERCOT. Now, the reason I point that out, that may sound like a lot, but SPP is about a 50,000 megawatt system. ERCOT is, I think, about a 70,000 megawatt system in terms of peak demand. 800 megawatts of transfer capability between our 2 systems is not a lot. There were times during the winter event, and I'll point this out a little bit later on, that we were receiving about 6,000 megawatts from our neighbors to the east, and 6,000 megawatts was very helpful to us, and that is a lot larger than an 800 megawatt transfer capability. In fact, it's a lot larger than the 1,270 megawatts that we had between the east and west. So we relied heavily on the interconnected nature of the Eastern Interconnection. We're really heavily interconnected with other utilities and RTOs in the Eastern Interconnection, and that's what minimized the exposure that we had to load shedding. All right, and then a little bit more about SPP, and I'll move on. I mentioned that on a summer peak basis, we have about 50,000, a little over 50,000 megawatts of peak demand, and that is a summer peaking system. During the winter time, we experience somewhere between 43, a little over 43 was our previous peak demand in the winter. This winter, we saw nearly 44,000 megawatts, and we set a new peak demand for wintertime consumption. But the generation in SPP, if you look at nameplate capacity, is well over 94,000 megawatts. The accredited capacity is over 62,000 megawatts, which is a little bit more than 20% higher than our peak consumption. That's, by all considerations, plenty of generating capacity to be able to meet demand when it's consumed at its peak. And even if you experience contingencies where you lose certain generators because they have to go offline for maintenance or they're forced out for some operating situation, that's still plenty of capacity. I want to point out just real quickly, because this will come up later, the difference between nameplate capacity and accredited capacity is this. Nameplate capacity simply represents the maximum amount of generation that all of the generators in our footprint can produce. It's the maximum amount of energy that they can produce. Accredited capacity is determined by either studies or certain operating characteristics of the generators themselves that tell us the maximum amount of capacity we can count on showing up during peak conditions. So it's not necessarily the nameplate capacity, it's what can you count on during peak conditions. And that's why that number is lower than the nameplate capacity. The energy production in 2020, what I'll point out here is that for the first year ever, wind produced more energy on an annual basis than coal or gas. And of course, wind, coal, and gas are our top three producers of energy in the footprint. You'll notice in terms of accredited capacity, natural gas supplies about 28,000 megawatts. That's what we should be able to count on showing up when we need it the most. Is about 28,000 megawatts from gas. Coal is expected to deliver about 24,000 megawatts when we need it the most. And then wind, about 3,500 megawatts when we need it the most. Now compare that to nameplate capacity. For wind, we have over 27,000 megawatts of nameplate capacity. That's the maximum amount it can produce. But because we realize wind doesn't always blow when you need it the most, that's why we've only accredited about 3,500 megawatts of it. Okay, I just wanted to point that out because it will come up a little bit later as we talk through some of the actual operating data that we saw during the event. Now, I'll also point out, to be fair, gas, we have about 37,000 megawatts of nameplate capacity for gas and about 28,000 that's accredited. And that's because we require firm transmission delivery of gas in order for it to be accounted as capacity. And if the gas generating owners don't have that firm transmission delivery rights through the pipelines, they can't count those generators as, or at least that amount of nameplate capacity as accredited capacity. All right. All right. So we are under the jurisdiction of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and the North American Reliability Corporation, which establishes reliability standards that we have to abide by. And if we don't abide by those standards, we are subject to penalty. It's over $1 million per violation per day that the violation occurs. So it's a pretty substantive risk. And so we take compliance with those standards very, very seriously. And those standards are in place to make sure that utilities, that RTOs, that the entities that do what we do can maintain reliability, that they know what they're supposed to do and that they do it in a consistent fashion. We perform emergency training on an annual basis. So it's not that we didn't know what to do during the event. We certainly did. We trained for these things. We trained for cold weather events. We trained for other, tornado, strong wind, drought conditions, all kinds of different scenarios are trained for on an annual basis. And it's not just the RTO that does that. Our utilities do the same things. We have emergency response plans that we're all responsible for maintaining, developing, and changing as necessary. And so just wanted to point that out, that this is something that's very important as we prepare to deal with these once-in-a-lifetime kind of events. During the event itself, we used a number of different alert levels. I know one of the things that we've heard from a number of entities is that they wish we could have communicated more. And I certainly appreciate that. So, but I do want to let you know that there are a number of different alerts that we have available to use during these kinds of conditions. The alerts that you see to the left-hand side of the slide are ones that we use based on the severity of the event. The ones that are on the right-hand side of the slide are ones that NERC expects to be used, again, depending on the severity of the event. So we even have more alert levels that we can use and ways to communicate about situations than what the minimum requirements that NERC has for entities like us. And we used every one of these throughout this event. Some of them we began to use over a week in advance, and some of them we used while we were kind of in the thick of things. And I'll describe these as we use them in a little bit. All right, so let's jump into the actual winter storm event, the emergency situation that we were in for nearly a week. The big picture, I talked about the training, so that preparation helped. We also began to, like most people did. I mean, we saw it on the news, we saw it on the weather forecast that everybody was predicting really cold weather. On February 4th, we issued our cold weather alert to the utilities that operate in our footprint. On the 8th, we issued a resource alert, and that's just kind of a higher level that lets them know they need to make sure resources are available. And then on the 11th, and if you remember, the 15th and the 16th is when we actually had to shed load. So the 11th was about 4 to 5 days in advance. We began to commit all generating resources that we had available to us, make sure that they knew they were going to be needed during the most extreme part of what we forecasted to be a very, very cold event. Public appeals were used. We think those were helpful. And as a result of the public appeals, we did see reduced demand, and we were glad to get whatever we could. Not only that, but we used every megawatt we could get. We ran every available generator we had. We imported energy from our neighbors to the extent they had it. They supplied it, and that was very, very appreciated. Ultimately, we did have to interrupt load. We did that on the 15th for about almost an hour. And the load that we interrupted at that time represented about 1.5% of our system demand. And then on the 16th, we had a little bit more load we had to interrupt compared to the 15th. That was about 6.5%, and it lasted a little longer, so it was a little over 3 hours. We do believe that the collaboration helped. It reduced the impact. It prevented us from what we could have experienced, which would have been much worse, would have impacted many more customers, and would have lasted longer. So we appreciate the collaboration with our neighbors, with our utilities, the communications that occurred. We know we could have done better, but we think with all of these things in place, we handled the situation about as good as we could have. It was a historic event, and actually, let me just move on to the next slide, because I think this really does a good job of depicting why this was such a historic event and why we experienced what we experienced. You can see SPP's footprint in the 14-state region that we cover. That entire region saw temperatures below 0 degrees. Now, it's not that abnormal to see below 0 degree temperatures in the northern part, in the Dakotas. But it's really unusual to see those kinds of temperatures in Texas, in New Mexico, and Oklahoma at the same time you're seeing sub-zero temperatures in the north. So it was so far spread, it was so widespread, it was so cold, it affected us in a way that we've just not seen before. In fact, SPP has been around 80 years. This is the first time that we've had to shed load across the entire footprint. Some of the drivers of the load shedding, we refer to those as temporary service interruptions. There were really 3 key drivers. One was generation unavailability. Again, we ran everything we could within our footprint, but ultimately what we saw was a lack of fuel supply. And the majority of the fuel supply that didn't get delivered was gas. About 63% of our generation unavailability could be attributed to just not having the fuel. It wasn't because the generators themselves couldn't operate. It was because they didn't have the fuel to operate. We did have some outages. There were some wind turbines, about 7,000 megawatts of the 27,000 megawatts of nameplate capacity that I mentioned earlier, that were out of service due to icing. But it's interesting, though, that icing condition actually materialized about 10 days in advance of this event. And it was due to fog, really low fog cover that was cold, and that created the icing conditions on those turbines, and they were not yet back in service by the time this event rolled around. We also saw it. I mean, again, I mentioned about 6,000 megawatts of energy being imported from our neighbors. When those energy imports began to rapidly be reduced because either they were seeing congestion on their system or because they ran out of energy as well, we had to take action quickly, and that's another factor that contributed to our load shedding requirements. And then you combine all of those on top of the fact that we saw record amounts of consumption during the extreme cold weather for electricity, and so those three factors were the primary drivers of our load shedding requirements. All right, I've already talked a little bit about this. I think I'm going to move on to the next slide. This really details the event and the actions that we took from a timing perspective. I already mentioned the fact that we issued the cold weather alerts on the 4th and actually issued several different types of alerts up until the 8th when we began to issue the resource alert. On the 9th, we declared conservative operations until further notice. And then on the 11th is when we began to commit generating resources, knowing that we were coming up on a weekend and gas, you can't procure gas for gas-fired generation over the weekend. So we knew that they had to purchase that gas well in advance. We knew that Monday and Tuesday were going to be the two coldest days of that following week, and we're expecting extremely high amounts of energy consumption. And so that's why on that Thursday, we began to commit those resources. The other thing that I'll point out here, we actually declared an energy emergency alert level 1 in advance of when we really needed to, because we didn't really need to do that until 5 o'clock Monday morning, but we wanted to make sure our utilities were prepared. And so we told them to be ready for that energy emergency level 1 at 5 o'clock a.m. on the 15th. And we did that on Sunday. We asked them to begin to request conservation, and many of them did. We think that was helpful because we saw a little bit less load show up Monday and Tuesday than what we were forecasting. So we appreciate the fact that our users, our consumers, actually heeded the warnings and heeded the instructions to reduce their consumption. That was very helpful. But despite all of that, and despite the fact that we were importing a large amount of energy, we ultimately did have to declare an emergency alert level 2 at 7:22, and then at 10:08 a level 3. I will tell you, an EEA 3 simply represents the fact that we no longer have the required amount of reserve energy, and that reserve energy is required to be able to withstand a contingency where you lose a generator. And we were no longer in a position where we had excess energy that met that requirement. And then not only did we lose what little excess energy we had, but by 12:04, we had to do load shedding. Again, it lasted almost an hour. We were able to restore it at 13:01. And then you can see kind of the same cycle repeated the next day, but to a greater extent. At 6:44, we had to interrupt load again. And it lasted a little over 3 hours before we were able to restore it at 10:07. And then you can see we remained. And go ahead, Andrew.
I just have a quick question. I know you said this was the first time in SPP history that you had to direct a load shed event for those 2 times, Monday and Tuesday. But you declared conservative operations on the previous Tuesday. How often has SPP had to declare conservative operations in the past?
Yeah, we have, and that's a good question. We've declared conservative operations. I don't know the exact number, but I know I think it was the summer of 2019, we were experiencing a lot of generating outages, both generating outages that were needed for just routine maintenance and forced outages on top of that we were in periods of conservative operations for several days. And that continued until later in 2019, we began to really clamp down on utilities taking maintenance outages during summer. And once we did that, we were able to discontinue the conservative operations. But I think we've had it once or twice even since then, just due to other events on the system.
So for past events, there were some lessons learned in those events. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's right. Yep. And again, conservative operations doesn't require load shedding. It's just simply making sure that our utilities are aware that if they have generation offline, let's get it back because we may need it.
So
go ahead, Commissioner.
Yes. First of all, were you surprised that of the load shedding, one, and two, at any time did SPP transmit any energy to ERCOT?
Yeah, we were surprised. First of all, I mean, I was surprised. Again, I've been in this industry now for 27 years, I believe, and I just never thought I'd see this. So, yes, I was surprised. I guess I kind of kept hoping as the event materialized and as conditions worsened that maybe those forecasted temperatures wouldn't happen. That maybe generation would come back online that was already offline, and that we were doing everything we could to get back. So I was surprised. And then secondly, we did deliver some energy to ERCOT, and it was energy that, it was energy that is delivered because they have what is referred to as firm transmission rights to deliver it. And we are not allowed by rule to interrupt that until such time as we're interrupting our own load. So when we were interrupting our load, which again on the 15th and 16th, we were in a position of also having to interrupt those firm exports that were being delivered to ERCOT at the time. So yes, during the EEA 1 and 2 and during other parts of this event, we were delivering energy to ERCOT.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
All right. Well, let's move on unless there's other questions about this timeline of events.
Hey, Lanny, when did you say that
Yes, sir.
When did you say that we ceased providing that energy to ERCOT? Was when we were having to reduce load in our footprint. Is that right?
Yes.
Thanks.
Yes, sir. All right. So I talked a little bit about a review that is already underway. And in fact, we initiated this review in early March. The board of directors of SPP directed staff and members to work together to gather the facts, to discuss the facts, to identify what went well, and to identify what didn't go so well, and to make recommendations for improvements so that we can, as best we can, mitigate the risk of this happening again. So we're collaborating with our members, we're collaborating with our regulators. The regional state committee that Chairman French serves on is very involved in this as well. And we're expecting to complete that effort. We're calling this the comprehensive review of the winter event, and we're expecting to complete that and have a report that is submitted to our board by July. I don't remember the exact date. They meet last week of July, and we're going to deliver that to them at their board meeting. And with recommendations, and hopefully the board will approve that report, will approve the recommendations, and then it'll just be a matter of implementing those. But I know it's a huge effort. We've got stakeholder groups that are meeting on a weekly basis, and they're working hard to make sure that whatever we come up with as recommendations are effective. We've got the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and NERC as well. They've inquired, they've asked a lot of questions, and they're asking for data. We've delivered that data to them, and we're waiting for them to provide whatever report they have. I don't have an expectation for when their report will be prepared and submitted, but I know that we have responded and have submitted data to them according to their data request. Okay. So I will discuss in a little more detail some of the operations data, but the essential point here is that we relied heavily on our interconnected network, and thank God we have strong interconnections with our neighbors. Those interconnections facilitated receiving assistance from them, and without that assistance, we would have been in a much worse condition. Would have had to curtail a lot more load than we ended up having to curtail. Our diverse generation mix, and look, I know there were a lot of reactions by a lot of different people. You had people that want to blame coal and gas, and you had people that want to blame wind and renewables. And the fact is we have a diverse generation mix, and every megawatt that showed up, we were thankful to get. And, we avoided widespread severe blackout, by making sure that we managed the situation, and that we did so proactively. We worked with our neighbors to do that, and worked with our utility members as well, to ensure that everybody did their fair share to keep this from getting any worse. All right. So let's talk a little bit about some data. So I talked about, we committed and used every generator that we could, but unfortunately we did have certain generation that just wasn't available to us. I mentioned the fact that a lot of the generation that wasn't available was because of fuel supply issues. About 63% of the generation that was not available was because of lack of fuel. That we saw during this event, generation, if you compare the generation available to us in 2021 against the previous 5 years, which is represented by the blue line, we were about 20,000 megawatts below our historical February average. And again, a lot of that was due to lack of fuel. The total generating capacity in SPP, if you compare this back to the three pie charts I presented earlier, that represents that maximum amount of a little over 90,000, 94,000, I believe, megawatts of nameplate capacity. This just shows you how much of that showed up, how much of it we had available. And you can see that during the EEA3 periods where we had to shed load on the 15th and 16th, we only had about 42% of it. 42% of over 94,000 megawatts available to us. About 65% of what was expected to show up. This accredited capacity is what you expect to need and to have during events, and only 5% of it was there during this time. All right.
Danny, quick question on that.
Yep.
Slide. A couple of things. I guess first, the key there from a resource adequacy standpoint or a reliability standpoint is probably that 65% number, because that's the amount of what we actually planned on showing up that actually did show up. I mean, you'd agree that's probably the key percent that we need to focus on.
Yeah, and it's actually a little bit lower than that, and I'll explain why I say that. The generation that was available to us represented about 65% of the 62,000 megawatts of accredited capacity, but 87% of that generation was provided by accredited resources, meaning that the other 13% just showed up, even though it's not the same generators that are accredited. So
that
to
was
some
actually
extent, we got lucky that it was there.
that's my other question, Lanny, is what are non-accredited resources?
It's the part of the nameplate capacity that we don't accredit, either by virtue of our studies just show that it doesn't typically show up, or because, and this typically applies for gas resources, because they don't have the firm transmission, the gas pipeline capacity to deliver it.
Gotcha. Thank you.
So, and I don't have the exact breakdown, but it could be that some of the non-firm wind showed up. It could have been that some of the gas that didn't have firm showed up. So we just know that of that 65% number, 87% of that was provided by accredited resources.
Does that include any imports, or is that not really looked at in this snapshot?
No, this is just for resources in our footprint, with the exception of those accredited resources that we do count on from our neighbors.
Okay.
There's a small amount of resources that are not connected to SPP's transmission system that some of our load serving utilities do count and rely on, because they've got firm capacity and delivery rights to get it. And then I thought, just to maybe bring it home a little bit, I thought I'd show you what was going on in Kansas at that time. So of the nameplate capacity in Kansas, about 40 to 43, depending on which time you look at during those two events, about 40 to 43% of the total nameplate capacity was available to us. So actually, it looks like Kansas performed about on average with SPP in that regard. Now let's talk about it. I just want to really focus on the top three: wind, coal, and gas. Those are our top three suppliers of energy. Wind for SPP, this is all wind across the entire footprint, produced about 12 to 16% of its nameplate capacity, with about 90 to 115% of accredited capacity showing up, but recognizing that only 43 to 54% of that was provided by accredited resources. So we had a lot of what we call non-firm wind energy being produced at that time. Again, glad to get it, but to be fair, it didn't come from accredited resources. And in Kansas, about 15% of the wind that we saw, again, we saw about 3,500 megawatts on Monday and about 4,000 on Tuesday, and about 15% of that was produced by Kansas Wind on the 15th, and about 30% of it was produced by Kansas Wind on the 16th. All right, coal. The amount of coal generation that showed up on the 15th and 16th when we needed it the most represented about 77 to 79% of its nameplate capacity, and about 80 to 82% of the accredited capacity, with about 98% of that provided by accredited resources. So I'd have to say that in terms of the accredited resources performing well, coal did very well. And in Kansas, during the two events, Kansas supplied about 21 to 22% of the available coal that SPP used at that time. And then finally, natural gas, and this is the one, again, fuel supply was the big issue here. During the two EEA events, only 34 to 37% of its nameplate capacity was produced, representing about 42 to 48% of capacity that you expect to have when you need it the most. And about 95% of that was provided by accredited resources. It tells me, now I will tell you that when we accredit resources, that accreditation is determined based on summertime expectations. I think this is one key improvement that the organization needs to consider. And that is, what do we do about wintertime expectations? Because clearly in wintertime, relying on natural gas to be delivered, particularly in an extreme event, is probably not a safe assumption. And what I can't tell you with any certainty is whether or not it wasn't delivered because it wasn't being produced or because it wasn't being transmitted over the pipelines. I've heard utilities say both, that in some cases it just wasn't being produced at the wellhead. In some cases it just wasn't being transmitted through the pipelines.
We've also heard they couldn't afford it, even if they could get it.
Yep. A lot of anecdotal evidence, but I don't have any real detailed information, and it is something that we'd love to get. We've talked about it during our winter review dialogue a lot, that it'd be nice if we could have the facts about what happened and what didn't happen. We know the outcome, but we don't know the key drivers. Commissioner?
Yes, Lanny, perhaps you answered that just then. If you did, I missed it. Let's kind of cut to the chase a bit. What, in your opinion, made gas unreliable?
Well, that's what I don't know. Because again, I've heard both. I've heard both pieces of anecdotal information. Some of our utilities told us that it wasn't being produced, or that it was so expensive they couldn't purchase it. They were being outbid by other entities. And then I've also heard, and we talked to one pipeline company that told us that at least their pipelines were on the verge of collapse because there just wasn't enough production going through them to meet the demand. And that creates gas pressure problems. So I've heard both, but I don't know it was the bigger issue the production, or was the bigger issue the transmission of it. I do know that both of those played a role. I just don't know which played the bigger role.
I want to circle back to this as we come to the time of our questions, but because I have some follow-on questions to ask, but I won't delay your going forward here. Okay.
All right. Well, let me do that. Talk about what happened in Kansas for gas. In Kansas, about 7 to 9% of the gas generation that was available to us was provided by resources in Kansas. And you can see, I haven't done the calculations, but you can see how much capacity for gas resides in Kansas. It's a little over 3,500 megawatts of nameplate capacity. And it looks like, in terms of, what I don't have is the accredited capacity. That's why I'm not drawing the comparison of accredited versus supply on a state-by-state basis, because I just don't have the details in front of me right now. You can certainly see how it performed related to nameplate. All right, generating outages. During the peak parts of this event, and you can see here just more evidence that gas generation contributed to most of our unavailability, about 60% of our total. We did see a lot more wind generation outages during the event than what we had seen previous to the event. In fact, during that first week of February, we had about 5 times more wind generation outages than the previous week. And you'll notice, you can see it kind of peak, and that's the green line representing the wind outages. You see it kind of peaked around February 11th or 12th. And that's because on the 8th is when we saw some icing occur due to that low fog cover. And some of those turbines just couldn't operate and just weren't available to us. Total generation capacity outage of about 35,000 megawatts. That's about 2.5 times more than what we saw the first week of February. So again, it's a major contributor to the event. All right, let's talk about supply versus demand. Again, one of our key reliability objectives is to make sure we always have balance between supply and demand. What I'll point out about the yellow line, which represents generation supply, is in this case, we included the energy we were receiving from our neighbors. To just show you how, we had excess supply when you counted on energy coming in from our neighbors, we were fine until some of those imports, and that's primarily what happened. It wasn't generation being lost on our system. It was generation that we were counting on from our neighbors that began to be discontinued. And when that occurred, you'll notice the red kind of oval that shows you when the supply dropped below the demand, and that's when we had to issue the load shedding instructions on the 15th, and then again you can see on the 16th. Interestingly enough, our demand on the 15th, we were actually past what we call the morning pickup. That was around noon, and demand was beginning to drop off. But by the same token, we were losing energy much faster than the demand was dropping off. On Tuesday, this occurred about the time demand was rapidly picking up, as it normally does during the wintertime, during the early morning. And we just didn't have enough resources at the time to keep up. And then on top of that, some of the imports we were counting on began to be interrupted as well. This really highlights the amount of energy being imported and the effects that it had on our ability to meet our load plus reserve obligations. It's a key distinction comparing this graph against the previous one. The yellow line represents our demand plus our reserve amount of energy that we're expected to carry. And so that just kind of shows and indicates when we had to call the EEA 3 at 10:08, and then when the blue line representing supply not only dropped below the yellow line, which is our reserve amount, but also below the green line, which is the actual demand. And that's why we had to curtail, about 610 megawatts of load at that point. Now that's on the 15th. The energy imports that we were relying on, you can see how they changed throughout the day. And you can see the rapid drop off that contributed to our supply issue. On the 16th, same kind of situation, just began to happen a lot earlier in the day. And you can see when we had to issue load shedding instructions, we actually issued 2 load shedding instructions, each one of them for the same amount of load, which also caused a little bit of confusion with our utilities. But we did 2 separate instructions, and we were able to restore that at a little after 10 o'clock, and particularly as we began to count on more imports coming in. And you can see here again, I will tell you, I don't think I've mentioned this yet, the imported energy that began to be curtailed and caused us to go into our own load shedding instructions. There were 2 things contributing to that. One, that the system to our east began to experience their own transmission limitations. And in order to protect that system, they had to cease the supplying of energy to us. And then they also began to experience their own supply issues in the southern part of their footprint about the same time, and had to retain some of that energy for themselves. So this just represents, and really focusing on the 2 EEA 3 events, the energy that we relied on, again, just pointing out that we were using every megawatt we could. You can see the green area represents the wind that was supplied and how it changed throughout those 2 days. You can see the amount of gas that was supplied and how it changed, the amount of coal represented by the blue shaded area, and then the amount of imports, which is the purple shaded area at the top. And then, of course, the black line at the very top represents the demand and how we were able to meet it with the energy that we had, with the exception of having to curtail load when we just didn't have enough energy. All right. This is the average supply mix during the 15th when we were issuing the controlled service interruptions. I'll just note that about 11% of our energy was supplied by imports. And that's really probably one of the biggest differences when you look at the 15th versus the 16th. That amount of imported energy dropped to about 9% of our mix. Wind actually increased dramatically from 7.6% on the 15th to 10.5% of our energy mix on the 16th. All right, and then I just point this out, try to give you a state-by-state perspective. When we began to reduce demand on both the 15th and the 16th, you can see that, basically those black, if the circle's completely black, that means we were using everything we had available. There are a couple of exceptions in the North Dakota part of our footprint. You'll notice that there's a small purple segment, and that was because we had certain generation being manually reduced that was required in order to safely operate the transmission system in that part of our footprint. Same thing you'll notice on the 15th in Texas and Louisiana. We had to reduce some generation there, again, just to protect the transmission system. But outside of that, we were using every megawatt we could in all of the other states on the 15th. You can see on the 16th, we were experiencing a lot more congestion. And so that's why, even in Kansas, we were having to manually reduce some of the generation in the state because of constraints on the transmission grid that we were trying to guard against.
Now, when you say manually reduce, what is that manually? You're from your control station?
Yes.
Actually flipping switches? It's not the company back home?
Well, it's actually, let me just compare it. We have an automated system that would normally dispatch the generation according to, there's really two criteria that it will automatically dispatch generation to try to meet. The two criteria are we want to dispatch the cheapest generation available. The second criteria is to dispatch that within safe operating limits. In this case, because we were experiencing a supply versus demand issue, we were having to override the automated system and call operators and tell them, you need to dispatch this generator down by a certain amount in order to protect the system. It was one of those unique situations where we had two problems that were being solved at the same time that the automated system couldn't handle. So that's why we were manually reducing from our end.
Okay. So when you talk about manually reducing or when we talk about shedding load, are you able to differentiate between the residential load shed versus industrial and commercial?
Not on our end. In fact, let me just get there because I
Okay.
think that's the next. It's coming right up. So let me talk about
Right.
that.
All right.
This represents the two different periods of load shedding. Again, on the 15th, about 610 megawatts, and then on the 16th, a total of a little over 2,700. We did that through two separate instructions. The way we allocate the load shedding amounts that we need in total is on a pro rata basis to all of the transmission operating utilities within our footprint. And so I'll just pick on the ones that I think you guys are familiar with: Kansas City Power and Light, Westar, let me look here, Sunflower, BPU, I believe, is I think operating in Kansas. Anyway,
Empire.
we allocate a certain amount of the load shedding that we need to see to each of those utilities. And then those utilities have their own plans that they follow for achieving whatever amount we tell them to achieve. So they know which circuits to interrupt, which ones are supposed to be residential, which ones are supposed to be commercial. They have that insight. We don't have it.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Is that data you're going to accumulate, though, from the companies to actually better understand where the load shed occurred by type?
We haven't been asked to do that yet. This is the first time that's been suggested. And I'll tell you why. The utilities are best equipped. They know their system better than we do. They are responsible to the North American Reliability Corporation to maintain their plans, to test them, and to change them as necessary. And I would expect that interaction would occur between NERC and those utilities in terms of making sure that their plans are effective. As long as they can assure us that they can get the relief we need them to get, that's what we care about the most. We're not in a position to tell Westar, for example, you know what, you really need to avoid interrupting that circuit because of a hospital. We just don't have that data. They do. So they're better equipped to make those decisions than we are.
And I understand that. My thought is, during the pandemic, all right, this was an unusual year because probably more people were home than normally would be, or the whatever. But in terms of in an emergency, what switches do you flip? Do you flip the big industrial entities first? And I just am trying to get my thoughts wrapped around that in terms of future process. So thank you.
You bet. And I apologize. I know I'm using names that are probably no longer in effect. Kansas City Power and Light and Westar are now Evergy companies, but that's how we distinguish the Kansas part of the operation from the Missouri/Kansas part.
Lenny, if I could, let me follow on the line of questioning that Commissioner Duffy had just posited to you here, because obviously, as this winter weather event proceeded, there was load shedding here. And let's go back to the prioritization. How is the load shedding prioritized? And you're saying basically you're passing that responsibility on back to the utilities. Did I understand that correctly?
That's correct.
So let's take the commercial side. Do you have any idea what types of industrial facilities were being curtailed or shut off?
Only when the utility tells us, for whatever reason, if they feel they need to share that with us, that's the only time we would know. And I'll tell you, Commissioner, the reason I say that, I was getting calls throughout the entire event, and there were some anecdotal data points about mistakes that they had made that, maybe they shed somebody they didn't want to shed. Maybe they interrupted a commercial entity that felt like they had rights to not be interrupted. And so I just heard little bits and pieces anecdotally. And that's the only reason I know anything at all about what they did and who they interrupted.
I think in a bit you're anticipating where I'm heading, because I'm concerned about that very thing. I'm concerned about getting to the really root cause of why it is that for whatever reasons, natural gas was unreliable. yet there's such a huge dependency upon that as a source. It certainly isn't because there isn't gas in the ground. This nation has this area has an enormous excess supply of natural gas. That's why the price is where it is day in and day out, with the exception of this particular event. But let me proceed a little bit further with my questioning. So if I understand you, then as the SPP, as the grid operator, didn't really know which large industrial power users were reducing their consumption during these emergencies. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. That's correct.
Okay. What concerns me is I would think that in the ordinary course, there would be a concern by the utilities, and I would think it should filter up to SPP, that you would be concerned that certain kinds of users were exempted from being shut off or protected. For example, hospitals, that would be an obvious one to me. There are nursing facilities. Yep. There are certainly high-risk human residential uses that really deserve priority over others that might kind of fall in between being commercial or residential. And I think there ought to be some kind of prioritization there in the public interest. That would just be my view. But if I carry that on further, if the grid operator doesn't know which large power users are being affected, my next question is, were critical pieces of the natural gas infrastructure, whether it's production, processing, or transmission, were these exempted from being curtailed or shut off? Or does SPP know?
I have certain anecdotal evidence that there were wellheads that were shut off, and that had some impact. And I don't know how much. I don't know, if it was widespread or if it only occurred in certain locations. And I know where you're headed, and I do think there is, to the extent the utilities can't do what they're supposed to do in order to help the entire region achieve the balance it needs, or to the extent that an action they take makes the situation worse, the whole region ought to be worried about that. That is something we need to look at.
You're anticipating exactly where I'm headed, because I'm going beyond the wellhead. I'm going way beyond the wellhead. We have there's out in Brown County, it's the Jayhawk pipeline system. We have the gas infrastructure within Kansas alone, which is what I'm most familiar with, is incredibly nuanced and sophisticated. And each step kind of relies upon the step before it. And it's kind of amazing to me that the grid operator wouldn't know this. And I say why. I'll tell you why. Because natural gas was expected to be a baseload fuel, a major baseload fuel in ordinary cases, in the case of emergency, even more so. But yet, if these facilities, the processing and transmission facilities for gas, were not prioritized, such that they were actually being shut off, then basically they're being precluded from providing the natural gas to the power plants. And in effect, what we have is an accident, and we exacerbated basically the electrical shortage in the process. You follow my rationale?
I am, yes, sir.
So I'm really concerned about that. I think that we need to dovetail into that. And I think that really needs to be mined, because it's such a critical facet to think that maybe along with other commercial uses, one of the commercial sources of a major baseload fuel wasn't given priority treatment, and then is blamed in effect for its failure in the process, is a concern that ought to be researched. I don't have any more definitive information on some certain scores than you do. I looked most recently, I'll just share this with you, at the One Oak quarterly report, which was just out, publicly available. And in that report, they list well freeze-offs and outages as major sources of electric outages, as major sources of why it was that natural gas became unavailable. It's a concern that I think we really need to focus on.
I agree with you. Exactly, Commissioner Keen. Thank you for raising that.
And if I could go on to a slightly unrelated problem, Lanny, but one I'm concerned about as well. The natural gas prices during this 3 or 4 day period here that went off the chart, with volatility absolutely off the chart. I guess I'm asking this as a novice, asking you, an expert. Why is it that either SPP or the various utilities that were affected didn't take action, affirmatively take action, to either fix prices in contracts, engage in hedging operations that could have been used, or other contractual options to try to find some way that gas for baseload uses is not subject to price volatility?
I think that's a great question. I can tell you that SPP has no way that it can influence those gas prices. We don't have authority or any responsibility related to procurement of gas. And I'm not sure what recourse the utilities have. I'm not as familiar with how utilities that do operate gas plants, how they procure gas and what their contracts look like. I'm sure that's established on a case-by-case basis. I will tell you that the gas pipeline industry is regulated by the same commission that regulates the wholesale electricity network, and that's FERC. And I know they're looking at this. It'll be interesting to see what their conclusions are. I will tell you that and I've heard some really creative ideas in some of our stakeholder meetings that have been occurring to review the event. And there have been ideas that suggest maybe SPP and the gas industry needs to work closer together. That maybe, and again, I don't know how we make this happen because we don't have the authority to do so, but I've heard suggestions that maybe SPP as a regional transmission organization would procure the gas on behalf of its utilities and then allocate it accordingly as appropriate. So really, really good creative ideas. We just, if that's something that our members want us to pursue, we'll have to figure out how to do it, because today we just don't have any way to control that, and we don't have any jurisdictional authority granted to us currently to do that kind of thing. I will tell you, and I want to point out that the gas, we were seeing gas unavailability before we had to shed load. So it's not entirely inappropriate to consider the fact that gas wasn't there to begin with. But I do believe, just based on some anecdotal information, that there were some that had their electricity service curtailed during the event, and that certainly didn't help.
Lanny, if I could jump in, I know we've reached about 12:15, and so we're kind of past the first allotted amount. So first, I wanted to confirm it. Is it okay if we go a few more minutes with questions?
Sure. Yeah,
and then
as long as you want.
Oh, good. Second of all, I do want to make sure we get to our staff and allow them to ask some questions, but I'll turn it back to my fellow commissioners here for another few minutes if they have additional questions. I just wanted us to be mindful that of your time, and then to make sure the staff has an opportunity to ask a few as well. So Commissioner Keen, I'm sorry if I cut you off.
No, it's quite all right, Mr. Chairman. Back to the last point you were making, and I'll make another point and move on here. I don't want to consume more than a fair share of the time here. Incidentally, Lanny, toward that end, in anticipation of this work study, we were provided with 3 slide decks that SPP had prepared Now you have a fourth one now with the one you're giving us. I spent a lot of time working through these, and in some instances, I had more questions than I did answers provided by the slide deck. With your indulgence and in the interest of time here, what I would like to do is post this work study. If I could provide you with, I have several questions. If I could put those in written form, provide those to you, ask you to respond to those, I would be grateful.
Absolutely.
Okay. We're all concerned. I'm going to say this much less eloquently than our chair did in a previous event. But although we don't have jurisdiction over all these municipal electric utilities, we're as empathetic as we can possibly be without having jurisdiction. It's frustrating to us that so many of these communities, so many rural communities across the landscape of Kansas are suffering financially so severely because of the price volatility that occurred in this instance. So I think we're all concerned that whatever investigations need to be undertaken are so that we can get to the bottom of exactly what actually caused this to happen. I think with that and with your willingness to answer my questions, and there could be quite a few of them, my friend, because I spent a lot of time trying to anticipate this, not in anticipation of harassing you, but trying to understand what the heck's happening here. It's such a big deal to all of us. So with your commitment there, I'll pass on my questions for now and turn it back to either of my two commissioners, allies.
Thank you, Commissioner Keene. Commissioner Duffy, did you have any more questions at this time before we turn to some others?
I was just going to ask, was MISO affected like we were at the SPP? I've really not seen much in the news about, or are they so far north that this really wasn't that big of a weather event for them?
They, Commissioner, they weren't as affected. And I thought I'd just kind of harken back to this slide. You'll note where MISO's footprint resides.
Right.
And they did have some cold temperatures, but not quite as extreme as the part of the country that our footprint resides in. I do know that on Tuesday, I believe it was, the southern part of their footprint did experience some load shedding. I don't have the exact number in front of me, but I don't believe it was as great as ours. And they also had some local transmission issues that required them to shed some load just to protect the transmission network in that part of their footprint.
Okay, and like my question about ERCOT, were we sharing resources with the Western edge, that Western divide? No. Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, well, and I will tell you, we were receiving, it was a small amount compared to the 6,000 megawatts of energy we were importing, but we did get about 200 megawatts from a company in Colorado, and they delivered it across our DC tie from the Western interconnection into us, but we weren't sending anything to the West at that point.
Okay, thank you very much.
You bet.
Thank you, Commissioner Duffy. I want to turn to staff, but first I have one question. If you could go to slide 25.
You bet.
This is the slide on how much of the accredited wind showed up. And there was one data point on here. I had seen this slide in the past, but there's a new data point. It's that one at the bottom where it says only 43 to 54% of that wind that showed up was from accredited resources. And I want to posit something here and maybe have you tell me if I'm understanding this correctly. Does that generally tell us that there were some wind farms that were providing a good amount above their accredited capacity, and there were some that were providing a good amount below their accredited capacity, but ultimately that kind of evened out to show that they were on the whole right at their accreditation, and as a further extension, that's kind of what we would expect when we accredit wind, because it's so dispersed across the footprint that you don't expect every single one of the wind farms to hit right at their accreditation, but as a whole, you expect it to be accredited at that amount. Am I understanding that correctly?
I mean, that's pretty much the same conclusion that I drew, Chairman French. I think, the science, so to speak, of accrediting capacity, particularly when you're dealing with a renewable resource that's highly intermittent, is sometimes more of an art.
Yeah.
And I mean, the 3,500 megawatts out of 27,000 megawatts of nameplate that we accredit. I mean, that's a number that's debated, and it's, particularly if you're somebody that's invested in a wind resource, you want to get as much credit for that as you can, because if you can't get it from that, you got to invest in something else. But I think in this case, our studies ended up being just about right.
Mm-hmm.
Even if we might have gotten lucky, because some of that was supplied by resources that weren't accredited.
And maybe a further extension here. I mean, I know you've said there's going to be a report. We're going to have lessons learned, both on the communication side, but probably on the operations side. And it could be things like, how we accredit resources. And, I think the emphasis has been on, well, should gas be accredited less during winter, or gas? But, maybe, I look at it too, that, if that's not where you want to go, maybe we need to be sending signals to wind that we want it to be more firm, that we want them to be able to be accredited higher, and to make investments to be more reliable. So that's just a thought, not necessarily, something I'm expecting an answer on, but I think we need to look at all of our options, ultimately what's most cost effective.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I'm glad you brought that up. I hate to talk about the cost of added insurance, and I really hated it the week after the event because people didn't want to hear it. But you buy insurance to protect you against these kinds of things, and the question always becomes of how much insurance can you afford, and that's the balancing act that we all have to take here. Is we want, believe me, I don't want to ever see another event like this as long as I work at SPP. But I also understand that in order to 100% assure that we don't see it, that could be quite costly. And are the utilities and their customers able to afford that? That's why we have good people like you in office to make sure that rates are fairly set.
Well, I appreciate those comments, and certainly agree with the sentiment. Well, I appreciate you guys sticking around, because our staff always asks such great questions, and I really learned much more from their questions than my own. So let me turn to staff and have them jump in whatever order they want.
This is Leo Haynes. I'd like to ask a question if I can.
Go ahead, Leo, and just give your name and title for Lanny. I think Lanny
Sure.
knows, but go ahead.
Sure. I don't know if we've ever met, Mr. Nickel. I'm Leo Haynes. I'm the chief engineer for the utilities staff. I had a couple of questions. One dealt with the questions that Commissioner Keene and Commissioner Duffy had raised around load shedding. And it's my understanding that the utilities will select what they're going to shed based on a circuit. So it's a circuit level they select to come up with the right amount of power that they need to shed. In that
Correct.
case, they make their selection to achieve the number of megawatts they need to shed, and they have 10 minutes to make that happen. Do you guys allow, or does SPP allow them to shift that load? I noticed on the 16th we were down for, I think, 3 hours at a time. Were they allowed to rotate through different circuits, or does that cause sort of an interruption for you guys?
No, of course, we don't have any criteria or requirements that we would place on those utilities regarding how they achieve the load shedding that they achieve. But it's my understanding that they all, at least to some extent, will rotate the outages so that no one customer or group of customers has to experience a long extended outage.
Okay.
And it varies. I mean, some of them I've heard will rotate on a 30-minute basis. Some will rotate on maybe an hour basis, but it does vary. And again, as long as they do it in a way that maintains the amount of load that needs to be interrupted. So sometimes they'll interrupt the next circuit before they restore the previous one, just so that we don't see those fluctuations.
Right.
But as long as they can do that in a reliable manner, it's totally up to them as to how they do it.
Okay. My next question dealt with that slide you showed where you had some manually reduced capacity. I think you had some in Kansas, and then also there was some in the Dakotas. Do you know the reason that that capacity was reduced? There was some limitation, I'm sure, but you said it was on transmission. And I know you have temperature settings, for example, on conductors, but given the conditions we were under, it wasn't a temperature limit or voltage limit, or excuse me, an amp limit that would make you think that you needed to reduce that because of a temperature limitation, was it? I'm sorry.
I don't have that.
Through that.
No, that's okay. I understand the question, Leo, and I don't have that detail of information with me right now. What I can tell you is that there were about 35 different parts of the system that were experiencing extreme overloads. And if you compare that to normal operations, at any given point in time, we normally have 3 or 4. So 3 or 4 facilities that were overloaded versus 35. So it was extreme. I don't know exactly which facility it was that was causing some of the generation in Kansas to have to be reduced, for reasons of congestion.
Okay, but it was due to transmission congestion.
It was, yep.
And those conditions are usually set probably based on a summertime type of peak, wouldn't it be?
The ratings of those facilities are usually established based on summer and winter conditions. So whatever, for example, ambient temperature that you would expect to see in winter conditions, that is used to set the rating for wintertime purposes.
Do you guys have the ability to waive those under certain conditions, like this type of an event where you could, bump those up somewhere, give it a little bit more room if you had to?
We do to some extent. And of course, we always talk to the transmission owner because it is their equipment. And we will consult them on that and make sure that we're coordinated because, it is, it's a facility degrade concern, and it's also a facility. What you don't want to have happen is the facility to protect itself because of circuit breakers and relay settings that are designed to cause the facility to trip. And when you lose it, then that can cause something else to trip too. And so we always do. We make those decisions as to how hard to run the system, so to speak, in consultation with the owners of those facilities as well.
Okay.
And I know I was told, I'll just give you an example. It's just indicative. We were importing at times about 6,000 megawatts of energy. Our previous calculations told us that 4,000 megawatts was about all we could do. So if that gives you any indication, we were running the system pretty hard.
I had one other question. It's kind of a curiosity more than a real question, but I noticed on one of that slide that you showed the various capacities and accredited capacities, that with coal, there was actually slightly more accredited capacity than there was for nameplate capacity.
Well, you were paying attention, Leo. I was hoping nobody would see that. No, it's okay. Basically what that indicates, so let me just go to that slide. We have some coal generation that's not on the SPP system that is counted as accredited capacity, but the nameplate capacity represents the generation that is actually on the SPP system, and that's why it's a little higher for accreditation purposes.
Okay, thank you. That's the questions I had. Thank you, Chairman French.
You bet.
Real quick, while you're on that slide, nuclear seemed, from everything I've read, performed the best. I mean, it was just your steady Eddie. Are you aware of any nuclear plants coming off in the SPP footprint in the next few months or years, next couple of years? As we've seen a lot of plant closures, but in our footprint, are we pretty stable?
I'm not, Commissioner, I'm not aware of any nuclear retirements expected. So, as far as I know, what we have now is what we should expect to continue to have for the foreseeable future. We do expect and ask our members to let us know at least a year in advance before they plan to make a retirement. That way we can study it, determine whether or not there's transmission that might be needed or something else that we might need to mitigate loss of that particular resource.
Yeah,
And
Commissioner Duffy, the
Yes.
last time we had a small nuclear plant up in Nebraska that retired, Lanny, what was it, 2 or 3 years ago? Very small, very old.
Yeah, I think it seemed like it was about a 500 megawatt resource,
Right.
somewhere around that range. But yeah.
So the only other nuclear plant that I'm aware of that we have in the region is right there in Kansas. So.
Yes, I believe that's true. I had to stop and think about that.
okay, solar is such a small percentage of the footprint, but did solar perform well during that time?
I'm sorry, I'm going back to the nuclear quick because I think there is another one in Nebraska.
There
Sam.
is.
Yeah.
There is a second one up there. Right, it's on the river.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, now I can move on.
Okay,
Sorry.
that's all right.
What was the question?
Solar it's such a fraction, but did solar perform all right?
We didn't even focus on it because it's such a small part, but my guess is it didn't. I mean, it's we weren't seeing a whole lot of sunshine during those days.
Okay, all right, thank you.
I will tell you, while solar currently is a real small piece of our mix, we have more solar generation in our generator interconnection queue than we have wind right now. It just means that it's in some form of development and could be added to the system at some point, but right now we just don't have a whole lot.
We can go back to staff now if there's other staff members with questions.
Sam, Jeff McClanahan, I'm the director of the Utilities Division, and appreciate your presentation today. Don't really have a question, but just a little more anecdotal comment regarding Commissioner Keen's comments about gas supply. That we've heard anecdotally that a number of gas producers shut down their wells in anticipation of being curtailed to avoid freeze-offs and environmental issues from frozen fluids. So, it seems to me, it's my personal anticipation that one of the biggest findings out of all the investigations is going to be the amount of communication that needs to take place in these kind of events between electric and gas utilities, gas producers, all of that. So just thought I'd provide that, but do appreciate you appearing today. So thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Jeff. And I agree. We were communicating a lot, but I think one of the biggest complaints that I've heard is we didn't communicate enough. So I expect that there will be a lot of recommendations around improved communications in our report.
Any further questions from staff? Mr. Grady, you haven't asked any questions yet.
Well, Chairman French, I better come up with one here real quick. So, Lanny,
your choice.
Lanny, good afternoon. My name is Justin Grady. I'm the Chief Auditor in the Utilities Division. I think we've met maybe once or twice, but really, informative presentation this afternoon. Appreciate that. It is afternoon, by the way, if you weren't taking
Yep.
taking note. So my question is just a quick clarification on slide 41.
Okay.
And I don't think you explained when you went through this slide, what's the green portion of the pie? What does that refer to, the reserved?
That is intended to represent energy that's set aside as reserves for reliability reasons. And you know, as you might expect, if we're in the middle of curtailing load, we've used all of our reserves. So that's why you don't see any green showing up in any of those pie charts. At least you shouldn't.
Okay.
Now, what I didn't do, if I didn't actually present slide 42, that shows you the capacity within each state after we began to restore load. So the situation's improved. You know, we're getting supply back. Maybe we're importing more from our neighbors, that kind of thing. And that's, you will see the green bars, or at least slices, show up in the pie charts then, because we actually did and were able to have some reserve energy available to us at that point.
Okay. And just a little more color behind the manually reduced situation. So is it just the instantaneous nature of the requirements to have supply and demand perfectly matched on the electricity grid at all times? I mean, in other words, does the speed at which a utility responded to the directive to shed load, did that influence the need to manually reduce one generator versus another, or is it localized supply and demand disruptions? I'm just having a hard time wrapping my head around the need to manually reduce generators during a load
And basically,
schedule.
yeah, and basically override the automated system's desired answer. And that's what we were trying to do. And so, you know, when you really need all generation to produce as much energy as it can to fix your supply versus demand balancing problem, but at the same time, you've got local areas of congestion, you need it to move down. It was a conflicting set of answers that were needed. And so that's why we had to override the automated system to produce a manual reduction on some generators. Because otherwise we needed them to go up. But, you know, the system is saying, I recognize there's congestion and I need them to go down. And we needed them kind of somewhere in the middle.
Okay. No, that helps. So quick follow-up then. So does the relative degree to which generators in a state by state throughout SPP had to be manually reduced, is that an indication of inefficiencies or potential necessary improvements in the transmission topology?
Well, normally I'd say yes. In this case, because it was such an extreme event, highly unusual usages of the system, I don't know that it's fair to say that, you know, it's because of just bad design or inefficient design of the grid. And I'm not sure that was the question you asked. Let me just stop.
No, it
there
was.
And see if that's
Yeah,
okay.
it was. I was just thinking. I was just wondering if you know, the automated the model produced a result under these extreme circumstances that you all had to override in order to protect the system. And so I just was wondering, is that an indication of areas where the transmission system needs to be bolstered, needs to be strengthened, needs to have rerouting done, greater capacity. It's just, this is the sort of thing I've never, I'm not aware if SPP models or stress tests its systems in these regards, but this is an area of transmission planning, I guess, or improvement that I wasn't aware existed or haven't been exposed to in the past. So,
yeah, so it's a great question, Justin. I'm glad you asked it in that way. Generally speaking, when we do our transmission planning studies, while the models we use for that 10-year out future, because it takes so long to build transmission, we try to predict what the system needs 10 years from now. That's why we have a 10-year out forecast and a model that we use. And while those models try to anticipate peak conditions, as an example, we will include in the analysis what we call N-1 contingency analysis, which is you just simply take a particular facility out of service and you find out where the energy flows, and if you've got an overload, you fix it. You identify a solution needed to fix it. And that usually is done through transmission infrastructure expansion. We don't usually, and by usually, I'd say 99% of the time, we don't do this. We don't usually identify transmission investment that's needed to solve these severe types of events. I do recall about 10 years ago, we had some severe drought in part of our footprint, and we studied that. And I think we might have used that to try to push for a particular upgrade. But usually, again, it gets back to that question of how much do you want to pay for something that you might never use? Particularly because I can remember I've testified before commissions in the past about why, certain transmission infrastructure is needed, and it's because of reliability reasons. And you've got landowners telling you, we've never had an outage. Why do you need transmission? And so it's a tough balance to strike. And but I think now one of the things I've heard is we need to do more scenario analysis, more extreme scenario analysis as part of our transmission planning studies. So it is being discussed. We haven't traditionally done that, but it is being discussed as a possible improvement. Long-winded answer to a short-winded question. I apologize.
No, it was equally long-winded of a question. So no, I appreciate it. That's all I have at this point. Thank you.
Along that line of your scenarios that you model or you do, had you ever done a scenario like this where there was an extreme weather event for this long period of time? Had that been part of your disaster type of related scenario?
Commissioner, for transmission planning purposes, I don't recall us ever determining how much transmission would be needed to deal with a scenario this extreme.
Okay.
I would highly doubt that we've done it. And certainly in my experience, I don't recall doing something this extreme.
Well, now you have the real life scenario to add to
That's
your
right.
repertoire. Okay.
Yep.
On page slide deck 43, while I don't know all of these entities, as I look, I don't know them. So except for the few that are in Kansas. But if you look at the states as a whole, what was our percentage of interruption compared to the rest of the states in the SPP in terms of, I don't know if you know by people affected or by percentage of fuel or length of time, but what was Kansas overall ranking?
I'm trying to add that number up real quick. 11 and 12. I'm gonna say about 21%.
And that's what I had
And that's, I just quickly added it up. So,
and that's what I have heard before, I believe from Evergy, if I'm not mistaken. It was around 21%. That said, should that really be our percentage? Should it be less? Should it be more? I mean, I hope that in the evaluation phase, that you really do look in terms of fairness. Sometimes I think we're overlooked, maybe. We're maybe a lesser state. But I think in terms of reviewing our interruptions, which is a fifth of the interruptions, and personally, mine was over 4 hours, which I don't care about me. I just know the neighborhood I live in and the neighborhoods turned off versus neighborhoods that were not turned off in Johnson County, not affected at all, probably better to handle it. I just get a little defensive when I think about our state and our folks being interrupted for not 30 minutes, not an hour, but much longer. Now, maybe that was a local decision. We're still ferreting all that out. But I do believe Kansas as a whole, I would like to know, practically speaking, how the others fared as well.
and I will tell you that at least the way this allocation was determined, it was based on the previous winter season's consumption. So that would then assume that 21% of the energy in SPP the previous winter was consumed in Kansas. Now, I will also tell you that some of our stakeholders are discussing changing how this is allocated. And one of the things that I know some states are, well, I shouldn't say states, some utilities in certain states are pushing is that, maybe we do sub-regional allocations, and that would be based on something different than just the previous winter's consumption.
And I'll just
It could be. Well, go ahead.
At our RSC meetings, I want Commissioner Duffy to know this is a topic of conversation among all the state regulators. Of course, we're all interested in why we got this share that we got, and I understand this version. I think there probably are other options. You could look at individual utilities. What are their reserve margins? Were they better prepared than others, and so should they take on the same level of interruption? But just want to make sure that those conversations are taking place among the state regulators, but also, as Lanny mentioned, among the stakeholder groups as well.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair French, for sharing that.
Yeah, and it's a contentious issue, as you might expect. I can tell you that some of our utilities in the Dakotas, I mean, from their perspective is we go through cold weather like this all the time. Why did we have to curtail load? We had more energy than we needed, and why were we having to curtail? So anyway, it's and the answer is, hey, we're all in this together. And I remember 2 years ago when you were having problems, and the South wasn't, and the South was helping. So I shouldn't say the South, the southern part of our region.
Right. So one other question. I know there's reserves for oil that the United States keeps. I believe there is also reserves for gas that are maintained. I've not seen anywhere in the discussion of where those reserves opened up and available to the RTOs or to whomever, to the gas companies to use. And I'm kind of baffled by that.
Yeah, not to my knowledge. I'm not aware that, yeah.
What is it?
Of course, as you might imagine, as you might imagine, I don't have a hotline to anybody that's got that kind of influence. But
But I think this is definitely, if this wasn't a disaster, I don't know what would be that affected so many people for such a critical period of time. And I've just not seen that discussion anywhere, and wonder if that was even a factor. Maybe I'm totally off base. I don't know.
I do recall the governor of Texas issuing some sort of, and I don't remember now what it was referred to as, but I mean, he issued some sort of directive related to gas supply. But you know, ERCOT was going through this situation in a much worse way than we were. So I don't know that it helped, but I do recall seeing something on the news about what he was trying to do for Texas.
Well, I think we are getting close to where we really ought to wrap up here pretty soon. So let me turn to my fellow commissioners to see if either of you have any final comments or questions for Lanny. I see Commissioner Duffy shaking her head. Commissioner Keen, do you have any final questions or comments?
One very brief one. I'll dovetail on what Jeff McClanahan said. Actually, the heart of the concerns I had about the gas supply and the potential outage of electricity, I think the nexus of it is an enormous communication problem, which I think really deserves some kind of attention to preclude some kind of recurrence of this for similar reasons. But the only final comment I would make is, Lanny, thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate it very much. More questions to follow.
I look forward to receiving your questions, Commissioner Keen.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
And thank you again. Thanks, Commissioner Keen and Duffy and Chairman French. I appreciate you guys have been very engaged, and I like having an audience that is listening and wants to engage in dialogue. So I appreciate that.
Let me then make one final comment. I mean, I think a theme of all of this is we do have a complicated system by design, but you know, we have different layers. We have the local layer where a lot of the decisions are being made on the ground that affect customers, and we even have some of those local utilities making decisions for unaffiliated utilities, and SPP is not involved in those sorts of decisions, nor do I think we want you all to be involved in those decisions. Those probably are better made at the local level. But the decisions that are made at SPP and the operations of SPP do touch all of us throughout the region pretty dramatically. And so it is really important that we have this exchange of information. And yeah, from my perspective, I think there tends to be a distrust of the large regional organizations that aren't, just situated within a state. And there's always a danger of that. I think for an organization like Southwest Power Pool, when folks hear that a decision is being made from Little Rock, Arkansas, but I just want to thank you all. I think that you all have done a good job of coming in and talking directly to the states, not just to me, but to come in here and be transparent and stand up in front of us and answer questions. I know you've been willing to answer some written questions as a follow-up, and I think that's key, that we continue to get that exchange of information. And I think Southwest Power Pool does better than most at doing that. And so I do want to thank both you, Lanny, and Sam, and of course, all your colleagues that we work with as well. I think it is really important that you're transparent and answer the questions. So thank you.
Well, again, thank you. I'll tell you, we're only as strong as we are interconnected, and we're only going to get better if we have a lot of eyes on this and a lot of help as we think through, what we need to do next.
Well, I appreciate that comment. With that, I believe we can adjourn. We've reached the end of our business for this work study session. So thank you all for attending, and have a good rest of your day. I appreciate the extra time.
Thank you very much.